everyone. Good morning. Hello, my name's Sarah Lethbridge. I'm the Director of Executive Education in Cardiff Business School, part of Cardiff University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to our breakfast briefing this morning, which has very kindly been sponsored by Bruton Knowles. I wonder if you'd like to just say a few words. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Bruton Knowles, I would like to welcome you to this morning's breakfast briefing. It's fantastic to see so many of you here today. So good that we've been allowed in this lovely lecture theatre.
Thank you. Yeah. Taste of student life.
It's tough these days, isn't it? So, as property consultants, we are delighted to continue our partnership with the Business School through our sponsorship of property-themed events such as this. The pattern of development and related infrastructure needs are key to the growth of the modern city. So this morning's seminar promises a fascinating insight into the ambition and continued development of Europe's youngest capital. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We're really pleased to work in partnership with organisations such as Bruton Knowles to ensure that we're able to deliver exciting nuggets of information from the university to our business community. So thank you very much. Just a little flag for our future breakfast briefings. Professor Laura McAllister is going to be talking on the governance and sport agenda, so that should be pretty juicy, I think. On Tuesday the 22nd of January, hopefully you'll receive invitations very shortly after this event. And we're planning with Welsh Government InsurTech. So building on our FinTech breakfast briefing, what does that mean for the insurance space on the 19th of February? Thanks very much for changing the venue this morning and being up for it. I know we're usually up in our Exec Ed suite. We've got our MBA happening there this week. If anyone is interested in our Executive MBA, you know who's in charge of it now. So come and talk to me and I'll be happy to take you through what is a fantastic programme. Just a little note that our breakfast briefing will be recorded and live streamed. So we're live across the internet right now. And in the question and answer session, please would you wait for a microphone so that our online audience can hear the questions and answers that are being suggested. So, great pleasure. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. We love it when we invite our colleagues from across the university. So, Dr. Brian Webb's from the School of Geography and Planning, and you're going to be sharing with us your perspectives on the changing face of Cardiff. So, thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you. Cheers.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you everyone for coming. So essentially I am from the School of Geography and Planning. I'm a lecturer in spatial planning there. So this is very much sort of from a bit of a planning perspective. And because I'm from a School of Geography and Planning, I will be using lots of maps. So there is a fair bit of maps going on. And also I'll be going through things in terms of sort of scales of different levels in which some of the things that are changing Cardiff, some of the trends and patterns that have happened over time, and I'll pick up on a few sort of key ideas as I go through. And I wanted to start first at the regional level, and sort of think about how Cardiff isn't separate from its surrounding regions. Its labour market, its housing markets are all connected in a regional pattern, and this all affects demographic change. So I'll look at the regional level. Then think about things in terms of travel and travel trends over time. Look at a few specifics in terms of regeneration and sort of where regeneration sort of seems to be happening in the city and where it might happen particularly in the future. And then finally into the retail side of things and look particularly at the city centre and how retail, online shopping, these sorts of things are changing the retail environment in Cardiff. And the ways in which actually Cardiff, I think, in many ways for retail is actually well positioned to weather some of that from a city centre sort of perspective. So first I wanted to, as I said, start at a bit of a regional scale. We should think about things in terms of the Cardiff Capital Region, the 10 local authorities. Cardiff on its own, essentially, it remains the largest in terms of population within the Cardiff Capital Region, but it's also important to remember that it isn't alone. Unlike many other sort of UK cities, the core city of Cardiff actually doesn't, it makes up the majority of the population, but there's still a very large population that surrounds it as well. So you think about areas like Newport or Runnison and Taff, and these areas actually make up quite a large sort of chunk of the Cardiff Capital Region. And there's been lots of variability in terms of growth. So Cardiff has seen a fair bit of population growth since 2001, rising by about 17%. Well, actually, Blaen y Gwent has actually seen to decline a little bit, and actually projections show that it probably will continue to decline a little bit over time. But overall, it's a good picture in terms of population growth. The region's growing, but the areas that it's growing are a bit different, depending on what sort of area and what local authority and what demographics you actually sort of look at. So as I go through this, keep in mind this is data for the Cardiff capital region as a whole, so this isn't Cardiff proper necessarily. And essentially over the past 4 years, the city region's population is growing much slower actually than many other city regions. So it's about somewhere on average. So it's done a bit better than places like Liverpool and Glasgow, but obviously hasn't sort of grown at the same rate as places like London or Bristol or even sort of Greater Manchester. So it's averaging about 1.6% in terms of growth between 2011 and 2015. For the Cardiff capital region, one of the key concerns actually that gets flagged is actually that it has a fairly old population for its regional population. So 18% of the Cardiff capital region are 65 years or older. And this compares to many other city regions that are much younger in terms of population. Obviously, you'd expect Greater London to be a fair bit younger just in terms of the demographics that it attracts. But when you compare it also to Greater Manchester or even a potential competitor, sort of city region, Bristol, there are concerns around the age demographics attached to this. And if you look at actually population projections, essentially it's showing that Cardiff's population is actually sort of the 16 to 44-year-olds, that key sort of working age demographic is actually set to essentially stagnate over time based on population projections. Cardiff City proper is doing very well in terms of that demographic, but it's the surrounding regions that actually tend to pull it down a bit in terms of its stagnation for that key demographic and that key age group. If you compare that in terms of, for example, Bristol or Greater Manchester, you can sort of see that there's higher levels of that growth from that 16 to 44-year-old. So this is one of those key concerns actually demographically that the city region is going to have to deal with and try and think through. One of the reasons, essentially, it has this low demographic and why it's aging the way it is because it also has very low levels of net migration into the Cardiff capital region. So between 2011 and 2015, estimates put it quite low in terms of net migration. So it has a fair bit of immigration into the city region, but at the same time, it has a fair bit of emigration, so people leaving the region as well. So actually, only about 2,000 people in total, sort of in terms of net migration, moved into the city centre, into the Cardiff capital region. So the region will sort of see moderate levels of growth, in part because of this sort of these sorts of trends, up until about it's projected about 2025, at about 3.6%. And as I said, that's about fairly moderate when you look at it compared to some of the other regions. But the population is projected to rise to about 1.5 million, so about the same size as Liverpool is as well. So it's growing, but there are some concerns, I think, particularly around some of the older demographic aging issues that are emerging. But as I said, the city proper, if you look at just the city proper of Cardiff, it actually is growing dramatically in all the sort of demographics. It's more the surrounding area. But we can't necessarily separate the two because they are so connected. So if you also look, continue at population projections just for Cardiff itself, as I said, it is sort of growing. It's projected to continue to grow up into 2036 quite well. Merthyr Tydfil saw strong growth in its workday population. So there are other areas of the city region that actually are also growing in terms of the workplace and people moving in and working into the different areas. Cardiff, though, and Newport are the only two that actually are net sort of worker areas. So essentially during the day, population leaves all the other areas of the Cardiff capital region to come and work in Cardiff and in Newport. So they actually see a decline essentially in what we call sort of resident population during the day. And then into the evening, that population obviously then typically returns to where people are living. So again, you can sort of see the interaction between the labour market connections between the Cardiff capital region and some of its surrounding areas as well that need to be thought about. So this sort of brings me on to thinking about things in terms of more sort of travel trends over time within Cardiff. So if you're thinking about things from the city region perspective, there's a lot of commuting that has to happen. That, as I said, that labour market is quite strong. You look at some of those commuting patterns. And generally, there's a trend that people are living further from where they work. This is a broader trend within the UK. In part, that's, there's land use reasons for that. Essentially, cheaper housing. There's changes in terms of sort of two-person households that are working, so people have to sort of make compromises as to where they work. So if someone works in Cardiff and someone works in Bristol, they might choose to live in Newport to split their time. So you sort of see people drifting and distances traveling a bit further. The good thing is, although I'm sure some people would disagree, but the data actually shows that road traffic levels in Cardiff are actually fairly stable. So traffic hasn't gotten particularly worse over time. Since about 2007, it's traffic counts and things suggest that it stayed quite the same. It actually dipped a little bit, particularly around sort of the recessionary periods, which is quite normal. But despite the growth, the main reason that it hasn't gotten that much worse is because passenger trips on rail have increased quite significantly. So from about 2002 up until 2016-17, it's increased 85% in terms of rail passenger journeys in Cardiff. And this is the reason everyone complains about the trains, because essentially the Arriva Wales franchise was awarded based on essentially a 0% growth scenario. So essentially the franchise wasn't designed to accommodate all of this new growth. And the new sort of Transport for Wales and the Metro project, which I'll touch on a little bit later, is designed to try and catch up to some of this growth in rail travel. And also when you think about it, unsurprisingly, Cardiff has 4 of the top 10 most used train stations in Wales. So you look at Cardiff Central, dramatically sort of higher number of passenger trips compared to some of the others. But some of these stations will actually, there are plans within the Metro to improve them, and some of the regeneration efforts might also help to boost some of that, particularly around Cardiff Bay as well. So, as I said, lots of maps. This essentially is commuting patterns within the Cardiff capital region. So you can see that actually there are concentrations of different areas within Cardiff where you have smaller networks of people, smaller groups of activity around it. But the Cardiff city centre proper also has lots and lots of activity, high concentration of movements and flows between people. This is data from 2011 in the census. Essentially the census asks people, where do you normally live, where do you normally go to work? And you can map those sorts of flows, and you can try and understand in a bit more detail about how people are moving and commuting around the Cardiff capital region. And Cardiff itself, it's doing quite well in terms of trying to adjust and trying to promote better travel in terms of sustainability. So if you look at the city proper, this is from 2001. This is the percentage of people who travel to work through a sustainable mode. Some people in the room might know the statistic better, but I think Cardiff City Council has a goal of about 50% sustainable travel. I can't remember the exact date, but they are trying to move towards trying to get people to move towards more of a sustainable sort of process and sustainable travel. And you can see obviously it's concentrated very much around the city centre down to Cardiff Bay at the moment, and also the student area, essentially lots of the students moving over back and forth around Roath, and those sorts of areas, unsurprisingly. But in the north, there are big issues there in terms of sustainable travel. And I'll also touch on, obviously, there's lots of plans for new housing developments on the northern edges of Cardiff. So if these statistics are already a bit of a concern, you can understand why some people are actually a bit nervous about some of those developments in terms of traffic as well. But as I said, this is from 2001. If we go to 2011, in 10 years, there have been improvements. So the City Council is actually making fairly active improvements to try and increase the number of people traveling. The numbers are getting better. So I think some of the things that they're doing are actually working in terms of particularly around buses, but also in terms of different types of cycling infrastructure as well. So there's plans for these Cardiff cycle superhighways. Essentially, these are areas where you have fairly well marked, oftentimes segregated cycle lanes that will run through different parts of the city to try and ensure that people are switching to these more sustainable modes. These are quite popular and common in many other parts in Europe. Places like Copenhagen is one of the more famous examples. But if anyone's ever cycled in Cardiff, the infrastructure isn't the best at the moment. So these are very much sort of welcomed kind of developments, I think, within the city centre. And as you can see from the map, if we go back a bit, trying to connect into some of those other areas of Cardiff that don't have as good of sustainable travel as well. So hopefully over time, this will help shift and change some of those environments as well. Some of the things also think about when we're looking at travel trends within the city is the importance of demographics. So they become very, very important to understanding some of these travel trends. So we know certain things about certain types of people depending on their demographics. So age and gender, plus also income impact the level of bus use. So people who don't make a lot of money tend to, just by habit, will often use the bus. People who have higher incomes will avoid the bus. So even if you put a bus in, someone on a higher income, even if it's the more convenient sort of route, they'll still tend to drive. However, if you put a rail station in, people on higher incomes will use it. And there's been lots of studies that have shown this sort of connection between income, but also, as I said, gender. So women are more likely to use buses than men. And so we have to think about, in terms of travel patterns as well, and also when I talked about the metro, what the metro might do in terms of certain types of areas and certain types of places. Because if you're going into areas that have higher income and you're putting in new metro stations, for example, they likely will have a better impact perhaps than perhaps buses, because of these patterns that we see in terms of how income actually influences people and rail travel as well. Bear with me for a moment. I'm going to get a bit more academic and show you some of the data that was a project that I was involved in with people from the University of Manchester. And essentially what we did was we linked all this demographic data about people from the census to that question around commuting. And we created what are called geodemographics. So essentially what you do is you take the most common characteristics of people and you figure out what links them all together, you group them, and essentially you can come up with sort of interesting names and things like this. But essentially they all have fairly similar characteristics, because people who go from one location, who live somewhere, often are the same sort of people who work in those other locations. So you can start to pick up patterns of different types of people and where they move. So in this case, this is an online tool that we created, so you can access that. But I've just quickly selected Cardiff Bay. And what you can see from around Cardiff Bay is that this is a map of all the people who travel into Cardiff Bay, but based on different types of classifications. So you can see the layering actually in which people travel and how they work. So a good chunk of people do it in a very sustainable kind of way from the city centre, but then as it moves out, you have people who often work in what we call supporting society. So these are the civil servants, these sorts of people who work down in Cardiff Bay, the National Assembly, County Hall, these sorts of areas, and where they live. And then as they travel outwards, you actually see how different types of groups and other people move in. So people like high flyers, who tend to be higher level professionals, but other things attached to them, so they tend to drive more. They tend to be white males of a certain age that travel further distances into Cardiff Bay. So you can start to understand the demographic changes, and if you're going to be planning and trying to think about how places are changing and the interventions that you're making, it's important to understand how people move from one area to another and whether those interventions will be successful or not. The opposite, if you flip it around and say people who live in Cardiff Bay, so you think about the various residential flats and things like that down in that area, the map gets quite small, so it shrinks down a bit, and also the types of people change as well. So you can see how there's this interconnection between the labour markets, but also what sort of market are these areas serving. So a lot of these new regeneration sort of areas are serving younger professionals, and actually you have people who actually are these sort of what we call high flyers, but actually they want to live somewhere down the bay, amenities, access to things, and they're actually traveling to work further afield by car. So there's sort of interesting characteristics that show up in that case. I'm not going to go through this, but just this is essentially what we mean when we mean the geodemographics. So the blue line essentially is the average for England and Wales. And for each of the demographics, this is how they vary. So when I talked about high flyers, as I said, they predominantly are male, white, 35 to 49-year-olds who almost completely drive by car, hire professionals, managers, directors, who are social classes seen as quite high. So you can start to see how the different places change depending on the type of demographic and the type of access to services. And then you can start to think about what sort of people might be using different types of services and different types of interventions. So I said, if you look more at consumer services, it flips it around a bit more. So people who work essentially in retail, likely, lower sort of what they call sort of social grade, much younger, by and large, they don't tend to be as white, they're more ethnically mixed, and they take the bus. So you can start to see these demographics and how places change and shift depending on certain locations. Now, if we think about this in case of, like I said, there's been a lot that's been said about the mass sort of new homes within Cardiff. So lots of new developments, particularly around the northern edges of Cardiff. And if you try and think about this in relation to transportation, you can, I clicked on an area in Lisvane. So this is how people up there currently travel. So by and large, each of these categories, if you actually looked into the data, they are ones who drive predominantly. So, a key issue for Cardiff is trying to make sure that they manage that growth. And research over time shows us that actually providing more roads doesn't do anything. It doesn't help. You can provide wider roads, you can increase lanes, traffic just fills it, and then you have to create more. So the big shift has actually moved towards what we call predict and prevent. So you predict how much travel is required, and you find ways to prevent people from using the car. You provide them alternative transportation modes, because ultimately you're just going to create more congestion. And so we have to try and think through some of these issues and try and understand how those developments might impact. And I think the City Council is trying to do that in many ways. Compare that now to somewhere like Ely, where you have a much smaller sort of demographic. People who live in Ely are traveling much shorter distances. They typically work in things like consumer services and what we call sort of blue collar kind of activities as well. So you can shift and see how these catchment areas move. But these are also areas that use lots of bus services. So when you're trying to think about transportation and planning in different areas of growth, it's something to perhaps also think about. In Cardiff, City Council have been, I think, quite positive in the sense of recognizing this area of deprivation that exists around the southern edge of Cardiff. So this is the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation. So for those of you who don't know, essentially it's an index that looks at a whole range of indicators of how deprived people are. So it's not just about poverty, but it links in, are you deprived in terms of access to services? Are you deprived in terms of health outcomes, housing, various other indicators, and it merges them all together into one. And so the City Council created essentially a strategy and a plan to try and address some of these issues, because you can see there's a very strong contrast between what you might sort of argue as the more prosperous sort of north of Cardiff and some of the southern regions as well. And I think in terms of regeneration, it's an issue that has to be thought about, because actually a lot of the regeneration activities are by and large not happening in those areas within the city. Just to travel a bit across the pond from essentially where I'm from, in Toronto, in Canada, when they've been trying to address some of these issues of social deprivation, some of the strategies that they've developed are to think about things in terms of neighbourhood improvement areas. So they've identified similar sort of areas in the city that have some of these concerns. And what they do is they set priority funds to try and target different types of initiatives with them. They work with charities to try and match fund them. They work with other levels of government, and essentially as a way to galvanize some support as well. So as a way to try and ensure that this regeneration activities are positive. And essentially the council are also required to consider the impact of investments elsewhere in other neighbourhoods. So when they're making decisions about where they're going to put in a new community centre, they have to argue why that community centre and that money shouldn't be going to these priority areas, and why it should perhaps be going, why it is going to the other areas. So they always have to justify the reasoning, essentially, for not investing money into these areas that they've identified as a priority. But as I said, when you're thinking about things in terms of the regeneration side, a lot of the regeneration activity, there's the northern housing developments, but also there's a big sort of pull, a shift in gravity, I think, within Cardiff down towards the southern edges. There's been a lot of emphasis on a lot of the regeneration around Cardiff City, Cardiff Central, and down towards the bay. So a lot of the activities, I think, are in some ways missing some of those areas. In part, the main reason is viability. People aren't going to invest necessarily in areas where they aren't going to make money. So I think that does make sense. But there's a need, I think, also for someone to look at how we can try and balance out some of the development as well. So in terms of regeneration, you look at Cardiff Central Square is seen as a major new development, and this is essentially seen as a response, I think, to a lack of grade A commercial office space within Cardiff. Cardiff has very much tried to position itself, particularly in the past, as sort of a retail city. So they've made a lot of investments in retail, expanding the retail footprint of the city, but at the expense of perhaps grade A commercial office space. And the idea behind Central Square is to try and, I guess, is to create that. But even then, compared to other places and other types of investments, Cardiff City Centre isn't necessarily as good of a bet sometimes as other places. You need a sort of anchor tenants. You need the BBC to come in. Cardiff University has a building there. So oftentimes there's a need sort of for that public input first to try and say, yes, we're serious about this. And I think they've done that in this case. But essentially what this has done is it's linked into ideas of hypermobility. So, essentially there's been there's this push now that we don't sit necessarily where we stay. So the linkages towards London, towards Bristol, within Cardiff Centre, makes things far more important for people. So these developments become more attractive because of that. And as I said, there's this gravity shift, I think, south. So just south of the rail corridor, there's a lot of sort of land, urban regeneration land that can be used as well. And the area is going to begin to get filled in, I think, over time. So this connection between, down Dumbles Road, that sort of area, the gravity will sort of shift and pull down as more of the sort of grade A commercial space takes over, but also in terms of residential activities as well. One of the things that's always surprised me about Cardiff is, unlike some other UK cities, it hasn't seen the same level of repopulation of the city centre as other places. So you take places like Leeds or Manchester, and they have a very strong sort of population growth in the last sort of 20 years, particularly around younger professionals. So you see these sort of apartment developments, and oftentimes those linked to some of these other activities and some of these other services that have happened within these areas, linked to law firms, commercial development. And essentially it's creating a space that people can own that's also near amenities. And most of that activity has flowed down towards the bay. But I think that compared to perhaps other British cities, Cardiff is a little bit behind in some of those aspects in terms of infilling. So there are some developments around St. David's 2 and other parts of the city centre, but they haven't seen that same sort of big push towards sort of apartments sort of living within the city centre itself. Some of the reasons for this might be that actually the neighbouring areas, still, the house prices aren't particularly high in some places, so people can still buy houses relatively cheap in certain areas around Cardiff. But as those office developments sort of grow around Cardiff city centre, I think you might see a rise of residential sort of built environment apartments as well. Because broader trends essentially are related to access to amenities. So you see lots of people who might be working in those office developments are very much keen on being close to work. They don't want to travel for ages, and they want to live somewhere that's close to services, close to friends and family. And the city centres are gradually they're allowing people to do that. Manchester. I used to live in Manchester. It was where I did my PhD, and even while I was living there, I could see such a huge growth in sort of residential apartments and apartment units, as also at the same time as new developments came online. So they had a whole series of developments around the Deansgate area, and you can see this connection that arises. And I think particularly in the southern end of Cardiff, you might see more of this sort of infilling of both office but also residential spaces as well. And this links into some of these aspects here in terms of the redevelopment of the Brains Brewery, and this idea towards more mixed-use, well-connected types of places, areas that are close to employment, but also in terms of amenities. But as I said, viability in Wales is a typical concern. So people who are doing development activities, typically the profit margins tend to be not as strong. There's probably people in the audience who know this sort of stuff better than I do. But it does seem to be, in terms of development, there are some concerns around viability issues within areas of Cardiff and its regeneration. But I think also this shift towards more of a southern sort of pull will be facilitated also by the metro. So these are plans to develop new stations, particularly down near Cardiff Bay. And this will make this area even more connected, particularly into the labour markets further north, into the valleys. And so a lot of the regeneration activities, I think, might shift a bit more towards there. There are plans already for an arena down by the Red Dragon Centre in County Hall. And you're also starting to see house prices already starting to rise in some of these surrounding areas, particularly certain parts of Grangetown. House prices are already rising as a result of some of the developments, particularly within Central Square, but also some of the developments the city itself has been doing. So there's a project called Greener Grangetown, which essentially is a green infrastructure project, trying to manage water flow, but as a result of it, it's made the area more pleasant. Essentially, it captures rainwater, but at the same time, there's vegetation, trees. People are planting things in the verges, but also it's linked in, connected to an increase in sustainable travel as well. So they haven't actually seen a decline in. They've seen a decline in car use and actually an increase in people cycling from those areas as well. So some of those trends are also continuing in that way. The final bit that I wanted to touch on essentially is about the retail environment within Cardiff, and particularly looking specifically at the city centre. This image here is an image of Centre Plan, which some of you may recall, was an original plan for Cardiff city centre, which thankfully was never went through. Very much everything about lots of different connections, levels, so you'd walk in terms of bridges and things around the city centre. And I think it was the Big Sleep, if you know that development. Actually, it was originally developed that you'd enter it from an elevated sort of walkway, and I think that's kind of still there. But essentially, thankfully, those plans never came to fruition. But the area has seen lots of change. So this is just a map of the city centre landscape, and everything in red on that screen essentially has changed since 1901. So between 1901 and 2018, the whole area of Cardiff has largely changed. The areas that essentially have stayed the same are conservation areas, by and large. Similarly, since 1958, you can see even then another round of change in terms of the areas being developed. And I think this was a very deliberate act by the city to try, as I said, to attract and create Cardiff as a retail sort of destination. And it's been fairly successful, I think, in terms of that. So, as I said, it's positioned itself fairly well as a retail city. So the John Lewis, the St. David's 2 developments, and trying to create a regional shopping sort of catchment that was much larger than its footprint. You think about the size of Cardiff, just slightly over 350,000, 360,000. For the scale, it attracts people in terms of retail quite strongly. The biggest shift also in retail is online shopping, obviously. So it's changing the way that people shop. And the big importance now is being linked into leisure and leisure activities. So creating a mix of different types of activities. Anyone can go and buy something online. They can't go and sort of enjoy a cup of coffee and a chat with friends and walk around. And I think Cardiff City Centre has managed to create an environment that is conducive to that type of activity. And particularly it's done that through things like pedestrianisation. So over time, obviously Cardiff City Centre is gradually pedestrianised, but as a city centre, it's quite unique in that sense in many other major UK cities for being as pedestrianised as it is. It started in 1978 on Queen Street, which created it as a key corridor. As I said, also you see that shift south not just in terms of other types of growth, but also in terms of retail activity. So Queen Street has suffered a little bit from that shift downwards. But it's trying again to reinvent itself. So you start to see more coffee shops, more different types of activities rather than just the pure retail going in up there now. And then from 1995, there were lots of indoor shopping centres that were developed. You think about the first St. David's, lots of other Oxford arcades, different types of activities to try and build on the success of pedestrianisation. And then finally you had St. David's 2, where there was a very large sort of scale pedestrianisation of the area. And it's played, I think, a key role in creating resilience to a lot of these online shopping trends, creating an environment that people want to shop and do it in more of a leisure sort of capacity rather than just to buy things online. And it's essentially research has shown that pedestrians typically spend approximately 30% more than motorists in different types of retail activities. So trying to attract people, the location of the city centre, having it connected into some of those transportation modes that aren't necessarily motor-based is actually quite a positive thing. And since 2001, footfall has actually doubled within the area from about 19 million to around 40 million in terms of footfall within the pedestrianised areas of Cardiff. So it's been quite successful in that sense. But I think what we also see is a lot of flagship stores are leveraging this sort of larger catchment area. So there's also trends within some bigger retailers. Actually, their stores in some of these city centres don't make money. They're not successful, but they act as a brand that remind people that they still exist. They might go in, they look at stuff, and then they go home and buy it online. So they still have a purpose, even if the store itself might actually be losing money. It has a broader sort of role in promoting the brand from an online shopping kind of way, or even acting as like sort of a click and collect kind of store. And I think the variety of offer creates a lot of vitality, but the city centre itself in that area maybe needs to think a bit more about trying to ensure there's more nightlife activities in certain parts of the area to create a better mix, perhaps, of day and nighttime activities as well. And just finally to sort of finish on, this is Strøget Street in Copenhagen is seen as one of the exemplars of this. So this is one of the longest pedestrianised streets in the world, but it has a huge mix of activities that go on within it, and they really use their pedestrianised environment to try and promote and keep the city centre of the city vital. And also at the same time, they have lots of different brands, so there's name brands, but also some of the more independent shops, and they use the spaces in lots of different ways. So perhaps it's also useful to think about different ways in which the city centre might change and adapt to some of these types of circumstances. So just in summary, I know it was a bit of a quick whirlwind through different spatial scales. Essentially, we have lots of demographic change. There are some things we need to think about, particularly around aging within the wider city region. Sustainable transport is going to play a big role, I think, because as I said, trends are towards this, and there's oftentimes not as much space anymore, even for cars themselves. Cardiff City Centre has to think about issues of inequality and where growth is going, and I think that the City Council itself is starting to think about that, which is obviously positive. There's a need to try and accommodate some of this growth and where it's going, so I think there'll be that shift perhaps down towards more of a southern sort of arc within Cardiff. And then also, the changing retail environment is something that needs to be thought about, and how Cardiff can remain resilient to a lot of these online changes. So that was my quick whirlwind. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. It's so great to get an amazing condensed picture of Cardiff and everything that's happening. So now we'd welcome some questions from the floor. Please raise your hand and wait for a microphone. Oh, there we go, John. Who you are as well, please.
Hello, my name is John Summerfield. I'm a consultant. You mentioned about the planned developments to the north of Cardiff. Are you able to say anything about social housing? Is there a plan? Is there a master plan somewhere?
I unfortunately I don't know the details, to be honest. I know Cardiff overall does quite well in terms of affordable housing and getting affordable housing contributions compared to other places. It performs quite well. In terms of the specifics of the housing developments themselves, I'm sorry, I just don't know. There's probably other people in this room who might know a bit better than myself. Apologies.
Yeah. Oh, a different question. Let's see if anyone knows the answer to the housing question that we just had. Social housing. No? Okay, can we go to... Oh, there we go. Thanks.
Peter Kingsbury. I used to work as a planning officer for Cardiff Council. I don't know the actual details of the individual developments proposed for the north of Cardiff, but I can say that the council has quite long established and respected affordable housing policies, and I'm sure that the planning permissions given for this arc of new developments around the northern and northwestern sides of the city include a requirement to deliver a certain percentage of affordable housing as part of those schemes for many thousands of new dwellings. Probably the percentage, and I say this is somewhat a guesstimate, but it's probably in the order of perhaps 20 to 30% of the new housing in these areas is required to be affordable.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Like I said, Cardiff has a good track record of providing affordable housing linked to development, especially when you look at other areas of the UK. They actually they tend to be able to get affordable housing at a higher level than many other areas do.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Thanks.
I'm David Tristan. I work in the university sector in Cardiff, but I've also benefited from Green and Grangetown. I was struck by your comments about the viability of the city centre in day and night, and by your map of 1900 to the present date. And in 1900 there were far more canals around the city centre, and we still have at least one canal that runs underneath one of our main roads in Cardiff. Do you think there's any potential to sort of for us all to see the benefits of at least a canal through the centre, and how that might aid regeneration in a particular part of town?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely something that other places have done as well. So there's examples in places, to a greater extent, places in Seoul. There's other examples even in where I'm from in Toronto, of them wanting to do that underwater rivers that have been overlaid. And actually access to green space and actually also access to water is actually seen as a very positive sort of indicator. So it increases property prices, it increases activity. So I think those sorts of developments are always seen very positively as well.
Thank you. Any more questions over here? Get running, John. Thank you.
Jenny Rathbone, Assembly Member for Cardiff Central. I just, as we've got a planner in the room, I just wanted to probe a little bit further as to why it hasn't been possible to prevent developments like Lisvane and there's something else called Old Llanedin, which clearly are unsustainable developments because the transport links simply aren't there at the moment, although I believe they are providing bus passes to all these wealthy people going to be living in Lisvane. Because if we're not to make Cardiff, our capital city, a complete disaster zone in terms of public health, because of the air quality, why is it not possible to say to developers, you can only develop in areas where we've got good transport links?
Well, I mean, essentially Cardiff can, you can put requirements on developments that they provide different types of transportation services. So, for example, in the northwest of Cardiff, the developments around there, they are actually creating a separate corridor to allow the metro to be built in as well. So they are actually trying to build these sort of things into the development and into different activities. As I said, I think that the northern developments are seen, oftentimes, people have very strong views about different aspects of it. But as I also showed you, Cardiff is growing, so the big demand is essentially for for housing, people to live in, attachments to obviously affordable housing, because you need to maintain some of that labour market. But there are, the council can put different requirements on them to think about and to how they actually design the site plans and things for the different developments and the master plans. They have a role in doing that. And as I said, I know in the Northwestern development, they've been particularly strong about ensuring that happens. The Lisbane development I'm not as familiar with in terms of those activities, but I know in the Northwest, people in the council have been very adamant about trying to make sure that there are those connections, and that actually the development itself is designed in a sort of more sort of transit-orientated environment. And those things change over time as well. So there are lots of aspects of consultation that can occur that can help to change the plans themselves. So I think there are ways in which the council can try and link in those sorts of developments as well.
Back there.
Hi, my name is Howell William. I work as a consultant in media. I'm just curious as to develop a bit about the questions that you raised about the metro, or the issues about the metro. Have you an idea of the time scale that it will be required for the metro to roll out? And are there any constraints to its development in Cardiff?
I think in terms of the time scale, it depends on the different phases. So there's multiple phases as it rolls out. The first priority is going to be towards electrifying the valleys and the valley lines. I think the stations then will come, newer stations will come a bit later, further down the line. The first thing is trying to change the rolling stock as well. So they're on about using tram trains. So trains that can work both on heavy rail, where you don't need electrification, so further up in the valleys, but also can run on streets in terms of sort of streetcar tram level activities as well. So you can mix the two. So I think that's one of the key things that they're trying to develop. And then the metro actually, the idea is that it will actually roll forward into other stages as well, beyond just the valleys, into other activities, and also connections into even bus rapid transit and other aspects as well. Some of the things that are missing, I think, in terms of the metro is more of a strategic plan. So a strategic sort of vision. So the Cardiff capital region hopefully is being able to provide that, and also Transport for Wales can provide some of that. But I think what's missing is essentially a strategic plan that links the metro developments to actually land use. So there's a big concern that you're going to be building these things, but actually no one's taking an overall view of how that will impact land use, impact activities, and I think that is essentially missing from it at the moment. The Welsh Government actually allow Cardiff, all local authorities, you can create strategic development plans that can help to promote that. Now, how effective those are, we don't know, because they're still new. And
can I just ask supplemental to that then, just to pick up on your point about thinking particularly the city line in Cardiff. Are you saying that technically it would be possible then for that line to be connected to, say, a tram-based light railway? So you could have rolling stock that runs on both systems, then it would run on the city line and then convert to go on to, or be able to also run on basically a tram-based light railway.
Yes, that's my understanding, is that they are going towards tram trains that allow that to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. We've got over this side, if you loiter, the lady in the purple jumper. Thanks. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Helena with the Portal School of Architecture. You mentioned that Cardiff is a bit different from other UK cities in that the centre is taking time to kind of re-inhabit it. But I haven't seen reference in your presentation. I think there was only one note in one of the slides about the developments for students, student flats that are going on everywhere. Like it looks like every single new building in the city centre is for students.
Yes.
Can you say anything about that and how that impacts the general neighborhoods and life in the city?
Yeah. I think for those developments, as I said, they're essentially private developments, so they're led by the private sector. And this is something that you see, this is a trend that had happened in other places around the UK. You go to any sort of major city, you see these sort of major developments going on. I have concerns around them, particularly around their adaptability. Some of my research that in the Toronto context is looking at high-rise developments and the adaptability of high-rise developments to things like demographic change. So I think there are concerns around, one is sort of also the quality of the development itself, but also actually around the adaptability of those over time as demographics change, perhaps even policy changes in terms of, you think about things of tuition fees or immigration. A lot of these developments are targeted towards international students. So I think there are sort of dangers in that. And at the same time, them being down in the city centre actually can be seen as a positive in the sense that it creates vitality, it creates activity. Students somehow have a lot of money. I don't know where it comes from. So they're spending more in the city centre, keeping it vital, active at night. But at the same time, I think some of my bigger concerns are actually around the built environment and these developments, and how if something goes, something happens, how are those developments changed, and how might they adapt to change over time? I mean, the way that they're currently developed, it's hard to actually, alter the floor plates and things like this attached to them. And also, as I said, the actual design of them, I don't think is particularly good, which also impacts the landscape of the city as well. So if you're trying to create a certain type of brand and a certain type of identity, that can also have a negative impact as well. So I have concerns in terms of the built environment, in terms of actually the influx of residents. Actually, apart from, because it's the city centre and actually there aren't a lot of people who actually live in the city centre, I think it can be seen as a positive in that sense. I think it would be a bit different if they were pushed more towards other types of areas where they're already a bit overstretched in terms of student housing, like the Tays or something like that. But actually concentrating towards the city centre actually can sometimes help the vitality of the area as well. So I think it's a mixed bag in my view.
Thank you.
Brian, my name is Robert Chapman. I'm a property and regeneration advisor. A quick observation and then a question. Funny enough, I was speaking to some colleagues earlier on about infrastructure, and we were reflecting on the fact that oftentimes the cart is put before the horse when it comes to infrastructure. And so I wonder whether actually, because we have a city region, a capital region, and we have a board, a governance board that looks after that, representatives from the 10 local authorities, they should be looking at some form of strategic infrastructure transport analysis as a precursor to big strategic developments. That's the observation.
I couldn't agree with you more.
In relation to the question, a very interesting presentation in Cardiff, but you've nodded clearly to the wider city region. And of course, there is a narrative around city regions, essentially some research I did some years ago on the agglomeration benefits and the prospect of the economic dividends. But that actually needs to go beyond trickle down. That must be proactive. I was interested in your contrast between, correct me if I'm wrong, Cardiff, which is kind of growing, and there's a demographic scenario, a demographic differentiation between Cardiff, the centre of the city, and the wider hinterlands, valleys, etc. And I was just interested whether you were suggesting that there is some form of sort of policy requirement that needs to look at the wider hinterlands in terms of its vitality and vibrancy. In other words, is it dying and Cardiff excelling? What needs to be done to address the demographic issue in those wider areas to keep them alive and vibrant?
Like I said, I couldn't agree with you more about the need for a strategic sort of approach to the Cardiff capital region. I think it's there's a long tradition, I think, in terms of a lack of coordination between the different local authorities, and and yes, actually, everything, when looking at data and analysis, everything suggests that Cardiff is quite unique compared to the rest of the Cardiff capital region. And I think there does need to be some sort of strategic overview, strategic development plan, or at least strategy that tries to address that issue. And I think part of it is linked to transportation and access. So there are, I think, some concerns around how long it takes actually just to travel into different types of areas. I think there are concerns also around essentially, will the metro itself actually basically suck jobs? There's concerns around out of those sort of areas that already are there. I think there's also some concerns around actually the houses and the housing stock. So a lot of times people are concerned that the houses might be cheaper in some of the areas around, particularly if you think up into the valleys, but actually the housing stock itself isn't what people necessarily want. So I think there needs to be a plan or strategies that would link and try and link this idea of land use to some of these transportation and infrastructure investments particularly. And I think at the moment that's lacking. And some work that I did for Welsh Government, actually, we looked at things in relation to the well-being goals. And we did some sort of what's called cluster analysis to look at common areas. And consistently, Cardiff actually often showed up as its own sort of world. It didn't share the similar characteristics with many of the other places around that. And that is a concern, I think, for me, because it'll create essentially this tension and this dichotomy that won't be positive, I don't think, both for the people who live it, but also even politically. I think there's a danger of some of the cooperation that's developed might start to unravel, unfortunately, and I don't want to see that happen.
Final question. Oh, last one. Thank you, John.
James Hall, I'm a project manager with a small charity called People and Work. It's fascinating to hear your position on roads being filled, and just wondered whether you had, this might not have long debate, but as someone who travels usually up into valleys to work and living in Cardiff, I pass a lot of people parked on the 470 every day, and people trying to get up on and off the Coruscant Exchange. What would your view be? How would you solve what seems to be insolvable, which is the artery called the M4? Because whichever colour route, if I've heard your thesis correctly, building anything is not a good idea. But what would you do in its place?
The main idea is to try and improve the sustainable transport links within those areas. So you need to try and you sort of what you have sort of called carrots and sticks approaches to things. So create incentives for people to use other modes of travel. In some ways, actually, congestion does that. It creates an incentive for someone to find a different way to do things, and it has to reach a certain peak before that actually happens. Issues of even things like petrol prices can influence how people use sustainable transport over time. But that won't help solve the bigger issue at stake. I think the main thing is larger sort of transportation investments in terms of sustainable travel. You have to create viable alternatives for people. And I think understanding, as I was saying, understanding some of those demographics is quite important to that aspect. Providing bus services for people who typically drive, often people on higher incomes, they just won't take them. It doesn't matter if they're outside their door, they just won't take them. We know that, well, some people will, but the vast majority won't. We know that that's the case. So I think the idea is to try and make sure we link the types of investments in terms of transportation to potentially the types of people who might change their mind. And if you could even change 20% of those people by targeting different types of investments, I think that's perhaps a useful way of trying to change that. Because as I said, as the research over time has consistently shown in lots of different contexts that just building more lanes actually doesn't actually solve the problem. It temporarily solves it for maybe about 10 years, and then you have the exact same problem again. Whereas more consistent sort of initiatives and investments in things like sustainable travel, they are seen as means to try and adjust for those sort of things and to prevent the need for those sorts of lanes and extra capacity in the first place.
I think it's holding back
Anyone here come to the M4 Relief Road breakfast briefing that we did? I think, you know, I'm glad we got it in there at the end. Thank you so much for such a fascinating, informative and interesting conversation. Thank you very much for coming. I'm sure you'll be loitering if you want to have little private chats. So thank you, Brian. That's excellent. Thanks, everyone. That's really good.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Just a perfect history of everything that's going on. Thank you so much.